"You old fool. This is a restricted area. Move or I'll move you myself," Officer Derek Walsh screamed before firing his taser directly at the elderly black man kneeling beside the memorial wall. What he didn't know was that the man he just attacked was Kevin Wallace, a Medal of Honor recipient whose sacrifice had saved 47 lives in Vietnam. "Which state do you live in? And when a uniform becomes a weapon against those who earned the right to wear one, who will dare to speak the name of justice?" The morning mist clung to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial like a shroud of unfinished grief. It was 6:47 a.m. on a Tuesday in November, and the black granite wall reflected the pale sky with the solemnity of a mirror that had seen too much. The engraved names of 58,320 fallen soldiers caught dewdrops that looked like tears. The stone itself was crying. Kevin Wallace knelt on the wet grass beside panel 32E, his weathered fingers tracing a name carved into the polished surface: Michael J. Rodriguez. His touch was gentle, reverent, like a man reading Braille written in the language of loss. At 78 years old, Kevin's joints protested the position, but he ignored the ache in his knees. Some pain was worth bearing. He wore a faded brown jacket that had seen better decades, its fabric soft from countless washings. The sleeves were frayed at the cuffs, and there was a small tear near the left pocket that he'd never bothered to mend. To anyone passing by, he looked like what society had trained them to see: an elderly black man in worn clothes, probably homeless, definitely out of place in this sacred space. Kevin pulled a small American flag from his jacket pocket, the kind given out at parades, and placed it gently at the base of the wall beneath Rodriguez's name. His lips moved in silent prayer, words meant only for the dead and the God who counted every sacrifice. The memorial was nearly empty at this hour. A jogger had passed 20 minutes earlier, earbuds blocking out the world. An early commuter had cut through the path without stopping, checking his phone for messages that seemed more important than the 58,000 stories carved in stone around him. Kevin didn't notice the Metropolitan Police patrol car that pulled up to the curb. He was lost in memory, remembering the weight of Rodriguez's body in his arms, the way his young sergeant had smiled, even as life left his eyes. "Tell my mama I wasn't scared," Rodriguez had whispered. Kevin had lied and said he would, knowing that some truths were too heavy for mothers to carry. Officer Derek Walsh stepped out of the cruiser like a man looking for trouble to justify his existence. At 34, Walsh had been with the Metro PD for 8 years, long enough to develop the swagger that came with a badge, but not long enough to learn the wisdom that should come with authority. His uniform was pristine, every crease sharp enough to cut, every button reflecting the morning light like tiny shields against accountability. Walsh surveyed the memorial grounds with the eyes of a man who saw problems instead of people. The early morning quiet felt wrong to him. Peaceful spaces made him suspicious. In his experience, when things looked too calm, someone was usually breaking the law just quietly enough to get away with it. His gaze landed on Kevin, and Walsh felt that familiar itch in his chest, the one that told him something was off. An elderly black man, alone, kneeling by the wall in clothes that looked like they'd been bought at a thrift store. No visible veteran's cap, no obvious insignia, no clear right to be there taking up space. Walsh's hand moved unconsciously to his utility belt, fingers brushing past his radio, his cuffs, his taser. Each tool represented a different level of force, a different way to establish control. He'd learned early in his career that respect was something you took, not something you earned. The officer approached with deliberate, heavy steps, his boots striking the pavement with the rhythm of authority. Each footfall was designed to announce his presence, to make it clear that the peaceful morning was about to end. Kevin heard the footsteps, but didn't turn around. He'd learned long ago that sudden movements could be misinterpreted, especially when you were black and alone and in a space where someone might question your right to exist. He continued his prayer, hoping whoever was approaching would simply pass by and leave him to his communion with the dead. "Hey!" Walsh's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade through silk. "What are you doing here?" Kevin's hand stilled on the wall. He'd been asked this question before, in different places, by different people, always with the same underlying assumption that he didn't belong. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, keeping his hands visible. "Paying my respects, officer," Kevin said quietly. His voice carried the gravitas of someone who had learned to speak carefully, to choose words that couldn't be twisted into weapons against him. Walsh looked Kevin up and down, taking in the worn jacket, the gray stubble, the calloused hands of someone who had worked hard his entire life. Nothing about this man's appearance suggested he belonged at a memorial to America's heroes. "This isn't a homeless shelter," Walsh snapped. "You can't just set up camp here whenever you feel like it." "I'm not camping, sir. I'm visiting." "Visiting?" Walsh's laugh was sharp and ugly. "You got someone on that wall? Some relative who actually served their country?" The question hit Kevin like a physical blow. He could have answered it easily. His own name was there, on a different panel, part of a classified mission that officially never happened. He could have mentioned the Purple Heart scar that ran across his ribs, or the shrapnel that still set off metal detectors, or the nightmares that had visited him every few months for 50 years. Instead, he simply said, "Yes, sir, I have friends here." Walsh stepped closer, close enough that Kevin could smell the coffee on his breath and see the small chip in his badge where it had been dropped once too often. The officer's eyes were cold, calculating, measuring Kevin not as a human being but as a problem to be solved. "Friends, huh?" Walsh's voice dripped with skepticism. "What unit were they in? What years did they serve? Seems like a pretty convenient story from someone who looks like he never did a day of honest work in his life." Kevin felt the familiar weight of assumptions settling on his shoulders like a yoke he'd been carrying for decades. He could have recited his service record, mentioned the missions he'd run, the men he'd saved, the medal that sat in a drawer at home because he'd never felt comfortable wearing it in public. But he'd learned that some people wouldn't believe the truth, even if it was carved in stone. "I served from 1965 to 1971, Kevin said simply. "Sure you did." Walsh's hand moved to his taser. "And I'm sure you've got all the paperwork to prove it, right? DD 21-4. VA card? Anything official? Or just more stories?" The taser appeared in Walsh's hand, like a magic trick designed to make dignity disappear. Kevin had seen weapons before, more than this young officer could imagine, but there was something particularly cruel about having one pointed at you while you knelt beside the graves of brothers who had died, so that others might live free. "Sir, I'm not causing any trouble," Kevin said, his voice steady despite the fear that was beginning to coil in his stomach. "I come here every month to honor the fallen." "You old fool. This is a restricted area," Walsh screamed, his voice echoing off the memorial walls like a desecration. "Move or I'll move you myself." Kevin remained kneeling, his hand still touching Rodriguez's name. He could move, his body was old but still strong enough to stand and walk away. But something inside him refused to be driven from this sacred ground by fear. These were his brothers carved in stone, and he would not dishonor their memory by running. "I have every right to be here," Kevin said quietly. That was when Walsh pulled the trigger. The taser dart struck Kevin in the back, sending 50,000 volts of electricity coursing through his 78-year-old body. The shock seized his muscles, locked his joints, and sent him sprawling forward onto the wet grass. His face hit the ground inches from the small American flag he'd placed by Rodriguez's name. The electrical current lasted 5 seconds. 5 seconds that felt like forever to Kevin. 5 seconds that would replay in the minds of witnesses for years to come. When it stopped, Kevin lay still for a moment, his body trembling not from the electricity but from the sheer shock of what had just happened. A jogger had stopped running. A woman walking her dog stood frozen, her hand over her mouth. A maintenance worker who had been raking leaves dropped his tools and reached for his phone. Walsh stood over Kevin's prone body, the taser still in his hand, satisfaction written across his face like a signature on a warrant. He'd solved the problem. He'd established control. He'd shown this old man who belonged in this place and who didn't. Kevin pushed himself up slowly, his movements careful and measured. Grass stains marked his jacket, and there was dirt on his cheek. but his eyes remained clear and focused. He looked up at Walsh with an expression that wasn't anger or fear, but something deeper and more unsettling: disappointment. "Son," Kevin said quietly, his voice steady despite what he'd just endured, "you have no idea what you've just done." Walsh felt a flicker of something, uncertainty maybe, or the first whisper of a doubt he wasn't ready to acknowledge. There was something in the old man's voice, something in the way he carried himself even after being tasered, that didn't fit the narrative Walsh had constructed. "I know exactly what I did," Walsh said, but his voice lacked the conviction it had carried moments before. "I removed a vagrant from a restricted area." Kevin slowly got to his feet, brushing the dirt from his jacket with the same careful dignity he'd shown throughout the encounter. He looked once more at Rodriguez's name on the wall, then turned to face Walsh directly. "This memorial isn't restricted, officer. It's open to the public, 24 hours a day, every day of the year. Has been since Kevin's voice was patient, like a teacher correcting a student who should have known better. "And I'm not a vagrant, I'm a visitor." Walsh's jaw tightened. The old man was making him look foolish, and there were witnesses now. The jogger was obviously recording with her phone. The maintenance worker was still standing there, watching. This was supposed to be simple. Remove the problem, restore order, move on to the next call. "Don't smart-mouth me," Walsh snapped. "I don't care what the official hours are. I decide who belongs here and who doesn't." Kevin studied Walsh's face for a long moment, seeing something there that made him sad. This young officer was so angry, so eager to find enemies in every shadow, that he'd forgotten what the badge was supposed to represent. "Officer," Kevin said gently, "what's your name?" "That's Officer Walsh to you." "Officer Walsh." Kevin nodded respectfully. "Do you know why this memorial was built?" Walsh's grip tightened on the taser. "To honor dead soldiers. Now move along before I decide you're resisting arrest." To honor the fallen, yes, but also to ensure that their sacrifice meant something, that the freedoms they died for would be protected. Kevin gestured to the black granite wall with its thousands of names. Every person on this wall believed in something bigger than themselves. They believed in a country where an old man could visit a memorial without being attacked for the color of his skin. The words hit Walsh like accusations he wasn't prepared to defend against. He could feel the witnesses watching, could sense their phones recording, could hear the whisper of doubt in his own mind, but he'd gone too far to back down now. "You're trespassing," Walsh said, his voice rising, "and you're interfering with a police officer. That's enough for me to arrest you." Kevin looked around at the memorial, at the names of men who had died believing in justice, and made a decision. He pulled out his wallet, moving slowly, keeping his hands visible, and removed a card. "Officer Walsh," he said, extending the card toward the officer. "I think you should see this." Walsh snatched the card suspiciously, expecting to see a fake ID or an expired veteran's card from a pawn shop. Instead, he found himself looking at a Veterans Affairs medical card that read, "Wallace Kevin M., Service-Connected Disability, 100%. The card was official, current, and bore the seal of the Department of Veterans Affairs. But what made Walsh's hands begin to tremble was the small notation in the bottom corner, MOH recipient. Walsh stared at the card for a long moment, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. Medal of Honor, the highest military decoration awarded by the United States government. There were fewer than 70 living recipients in the entire country. "This is fake," Walsh stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. Kevin reached into his jacket again and pulled out a folded letter. The letterhead read, "Department of Defense," and the text was signed by the Secretary of Defense himself, requesting Kevin's presence at an upcoming Medal of Honor ceremony for newer recipients. Walsh's face went pale. The taser slipped from his suddenly nerveless fingers and clattered to the ground. "Sir," Kevin said quietly, "I've been coming to this memorial for 40 years. I knew most of these men personally. Some of them died in my arms." The maintenance worker who had been watching approached slowly, his own face grave. "Officer," he said quietly, "that's Kevin Wallace. He saved my father's life in Vietnam. Dad talked about him every day until he died." Walsh looked around wildly, suddenly aware that everything had changed. The witnesses weren't just random people anymore. They were Americans who had just watched a police officer taser a Medal of Honor recipient. The phones weren't just recording a routine arrest. They were documenting a national disgrace. Kevin bent down slowly and picked up the small American flag that had been knocked over during the attack. He placed it carefully back at the base of Rodriguez's name, then straightened with the dignity that 50 years of carrying undeserved suspicion had taught him. "Officer Walsh," Kevin said, his voice carrying no anger, only a deep and abiding sadness. "I hope someday you understand what this place means, not just to me, but to everyone who believes that service and sacrifice should be honored, not punished." Walsh opened his mouth to speak, but no words came. His radio crackled to life. Dispatch was asking for his status. In the distance, he could hear sirens approaching. Someone had called for backup, or maybe an ambulance, or maybe just more witnesses to what he'd done. Kevin walked slowly toward the memorial wall, one more time, placing his hand against the cold stone where Rodriguez's name was carved. He whispered something too quiet for anyone else to hear, then turned and began walking toward the parking area. "Sir," Walsh called after him, his voice cracking. "Sir, wait." Kevin stopped, but didn't turn around. "Yes, officer?" I'm sorry. I didn't know." Kevin turned slowly, his eyes meeting Walsh's across the distance between them. "Son," he said quietly, "the problem isn't that you didn't know who I was. The problem is that it shouldn't have mattered." And with that, Kevin Wallace walked away from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, leaving behind a young police officer who would spend the rest of his life trying to understand how badly he had failed, not just a war hero, but the very ideals that hero had fought to defend. The morning mist was beginning to lift, and the names on the wall grew clearer as the sun climbed higher. But for Derek Walsh, everything had become much, much darker. 53 years earlier, on a muddy hilltop in Vietnam, a young Kevin Wallace had made a choice that would define not just his life, but the lives of 47 men who came home because he refused to leave them behind. The same hands that had just been tasered while honoring the dead had once pulled the wounded from the jaws of death itself. It was March 15, 1970, and Firebase Charlie was under siege. The North Vietnamese Army had launched a coordinated assault in the pre-dawn darkness, turning what should have been a routine patrol base into a circle of hell carved out of the Vietnamese jungle. Sergeant Kevin Wallace, just 25 years old, crouched behind a sandbag bunker as mortar rounds fell like deadly rain around him. The attack had started at 0347 hours. Kevin remembered the exact time because he'd been checking his watch when the first rocket-propelled grenade screamed over their perimeter and exploded against the communications bunker. Within minutes, the firebase was cut off from the outside world, surrounded by an enemy force that outnumbered them 3-1. Kevin commanded Alpha Squad, 12 men who had followed him through 6 months of patrols, ambushes, and firefights. They were young, most barely out of high school, but they had learned to trust the quiet black sergeant from Detroit who never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. "Sarge," Private First Class Rodriguez crawled up beside Kevin, his face streaked with mud and cordite. "We've got wounded in Sector 3, medics hit." Rodriguez was just 19, a kid from East LA who wrote letters to his mother every day and carried her picture in his helmet band. Kevin had watched him grow from a nervous recruit into a solid soldier, someone you could count on when the world was falling apart around you. "How many wounded?" Kevin asked, reloading his M16 as another burst of automatic fire swept over their position. "At least 8, maybe more. Doc Martinez caught shrapnel in the chest. He's alive, but he can't move." Kevin looked across the firebase, trying to calculate angles of fire, enemy positions, and the deadly mathematics of courage. Sector 3 was on the far side of the perimeter, 100 meters of open ground swept by machine gun fire. Getting there would be suicide. Staying put meant watching good men bleed to death. "Williams," Kevin called to his radio operator, "try to raise battalion again." "No joy, Sarge," Williams shouted back over the din of incoming mortars. "Radio's fried. We're on our own." Kevin closed his eyes for just a moment, filtering out the chaos around him. In that brief silence, he could hear his grandfather's voice, the old man who had raised him after his parents died in a car accident when Kevin was 8. Grandpa Joe had fought in World War II, had stormed the beaches at Normandy with the all-black 706 Ida 1st Tank Battalion. Boy, Grandpa Joe had told him the night before Kevin shipped out to Vietnam, courage ain't about not being scared. Courage is being scared and doing what's right anyway. And what's right is never leaving your brothers behind. Kevin opened his eyes and looked at Rodriguez. The kid was scared. They were all scared. But he was waiting for orders, trusting that his sergeant would find a way out of this hell. "Rodriguez, take Thompson and Jackson, move to the ammunition bunker, and lay down covering fire on that tree line. I'm going after the wounded." "Sarge, that's a death run. Let me go instead." Kevin shook his head. "Your job is to keep me alive long enough to get our people out. Can you do that?" Rodriguez nodded, his jaw set with determination. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good man. On my signal." Kevin checked his gear one more time. He had 4 magazines left for his rifle, 2 grenades, and a first aid kit that wouldn't be nearly enough for 8 wounded men. What he didn't have was time. Every minute they waited was another minute for good men to die. He thought about the letter he'd written to his grandmother the week before. The one where he'd tried to explain why this war mattered, why the sacrifice was worth it. He'd struggled with the words then, and he struggled with them now. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. The men in Sector 3 mattered. They mattered more than his fear, more than the odds against him, more than his own life. "Now," Kevin shouted. Rodriguez and his team opened up with everything they had, raking the enemy positions with disciplined bursts of fire. Kevin vaulted over the sandbags and sprinted across the open ground, zigzagging between crater holes and abandoned equipment. The world exploded around him. Bullets snapped past his head like angry hornets. A mortar round detonated 10 meters to his left, showering him with dirt and shrapnel. He felt something hot slice across his shoulder, but kept running, his boots sliding in the mud, churned up by the bombardment. Halfway across the firebase, Kevin dove into a shell crater as a machine gun zeroed in on his position. The burst of fire passed inches over his head, close enough that he could feel the heat from the muzzle flashes. He lay there for a moment, breathing hard, listening to the sounds of battle around him. That's when he heard it, a voice calling weakly from Sector 3. "Help us, somebody help us." Kevin looked back toward his own position. Rodriguez was still laying down, covering fire, but the enemy was beginning to concentrate their attention on Kevin's route. Every second he waited made the return trip more dangerous, not just for him but for anyone he tried to carry back. He thought about his options. He could turn back now, report that the position was overrun, that the wounded were unreachable. No one would blame him. No one would call him a coward for refusing a suicide mission. But then he heard another voice, weaker than the first. "Please, don't leave us." Kevin Wallace stood up in that shell crater and started running again. He reached Sector 3 to find a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. 8 men lay scattered around the shattered remains of their fighting position, some unconscious, others crying for their mothers, all of them hurt worse than any 19-year-old should ever be hurt. Doc Martinez, the unit medic, was propped against a sandbag, his chest wrapped in a field dressing that was already soaked through with blood. He looked up as Kevin arrived, relief flooding his young face. "Sarge, thought you weren't coming. Never leave a brother behind, Doc. You know that." Kevin knelt beside Martinez, checking his wounds. "How bad?" "Bad enough. But I can still work. These boys need to get out of here now." Kevin looked around at the wounded. Some could walk with help. Others would have to be carried. All of them would die if they stayed where they were. "Listen up," Kevin shouted over the gunfire. "We're moving out. Walking wounded, help your buddies. Everyone else, shut up and let me carry you." What happened next would be debated by military historians for decades. Kevin Wallace made 7 trips across that 100 meters of hell. each time carrying a wounded man on his back, while enemy fire tore up the ground around him. 7 trips, with the odds against survival growing worse each time. On the first trip, he carried Private Johnson, who had taken shrapnel in both legs. Johnson was conscious, clinging to Kevin's back as bullets whined past them. "Don't drop me, Sarge," he whispered. "I got a girl back home." "Not today, son," Kevin replied, his breathing steady, despite the weight and the fear. The second trip was Corporal Peterson, unconscious with a head wound that had turned half his face into a mask of blood. Kevin couldn't tell if the kid was alive or dead, but he carried him anyway, because you don't leave anyone behind. By the third trip, the enemy had figured out what he was doing. They concentrated their fire on his route, turning the open ground into a killing field designed specifically for him. Kevin carried Private Williams, his own radio operator, who had been hit while trying to fix their communications. "Sarge," Williams gasped as they reached safety, "you're bleeding." Kevin looked down and saw that his uniform was torn in a dozen places, that blood was running down his arms from wounds he didn't remember getting. But he wasn't dead, which meant he could make another trip. The fourth trip was for Specialist Chang, a quiet kid from San Francisco who kept a picture of his parents taped inside his helmet. Chang had caught a burst of machine gun fire across his chest and wasn't conscious, but he was still breathing. Kevin carried him across that hellish ground while mortars fell around them like the wrath of God. Trip number 5 was different. That's when Kevin carried Doc Martinez himself, the medic who had refused to leave until all his patients were safe. Martinez was barely conscious, but he was still trying to direct treatment for the wounded, still trying to do his job even as his own life leaked out through a hole in his chest. "Save your strength, Doc," Kevin said as they stumbled toward safety.
"Can't still got boys to patch up."
"I'm getting them all out, every last one." By the 6th trip, Kevin was running on pure willpower. He'd been hit twice more, once in the leg, once in the arm, and he was leaving a trail of blood that the enemy gunners were using to track his movements. But there were still men in Sector 3, still brothers who needed him. Private Kowalski was barely 18, a farm boy from Wisconsin who had volunteered for point duty because he was the best shot in the squad. Now he lay unconscious with his leg nearly severed by shrapnel, his young face pale from blood loss. Kevin lifted him carefully, trying not to cause more damage to the mangled limb. As he started back across the firebase, a mortar round landed close enough to knock him down. He fell hard, Kowalski's body crushing down on top of him, and for a moment he thought they were both dead. But the kid was still breathing, and that meant Kevin had to keep moving. The 7th and final trip was for Private First Class Rodriguez. Not the Rodriguez from his own squad, but another boy with the same name, a coincidence that war makes cruel and meaningful. This Rodriguez was from Phoenix, and he'd been the first one hit when the attack started. Kevin had saved him for last, because he was hurt the worst, because carrying him would be the most dangerous, because Kevin knew that by the time he made this final trip, the enemy would be ready for him. They were ready. As Kevin lifted the unconscious soldier onto his back, the world erupted in gunfire. It seemed like every enemy weapon on the perimeter was aimed at him, like the entire North Vietnamese army had decided that this one black sergeant from Detroit needed to die. Kevin ran through that storm of lead with a wounded man on his back and a prayer on his lips. Bullets tore at his uniform, kicked up dirt at his feet, whined past his ears like deadly music. A grenade exploded close enough to ring his ears and fill his mouth with the taste of cordite and blood. 50 meters from safety, Kevin felt the bullet punch into his side, spinning him around and nearly dropping him to his knees. The pain was like a white-hot poker thrust between his ribs, but Rodriguez was still unconscious on his back, still trusting Kevin to get him home. 20 meters from the perimeter, Kevin's vision started to blur. Blood loss and exhaustion were taking their toll, and his legs felt like they were made of concrete. But he could see friendly faces now, could hear voices shouting encouragement, could see hands reaching out to help him across the finish line. 10 meters, 5. Then Kevin Wallace collapsed onto friendly ground, with Private Rodriguez still clinging to his back, both of them alive when they should have been dead, both of them saved by a miracle, measured in courage and counted in blood. "Medic," someone was shouting. "Get a medic over here." But Doc Martinez was already moving, wounded himself, but still working, still patching up the men Kevin had carried to safety. All 8 of them were alive. All 8 of them would make it home to their families, their girlfriends, their dreams of a future that had almost been stolen from them. Kevin lay on his back, staring up at the sky as medics worked on his wounds. The firing was already starting to die down. The enemy was pulling back, their assault broken by the fierce resistance of men who refused to give up. "How many?" Kevin asked weakly. "How many what, Sarge?" Doc Martinez knelt beside him, checking the bullet wound in his side. "How many did we save?" "All of them." "You got all of them out?" Kevin closed his eyes and smiled. 47 men in the firebase, and they were all going home. Some wounded, some scarred, but all alive. All because one man had decided that courage mattered more than fear, that brotherhood mattered more than self-preservation. The citation for Kevin's Medal of Honor would read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity, at the risk of his life above and beyond the call of duty, while serving as squad leader with Company A." But the real story was simpler and more complex than any official language could capture. A young man from Detroit had looked at impossible odds and decided they didn't matter. He had seen brothers in need and refused to abandon them. He had carried each of them to safety on his back, one trip at a time, while enemy fire tried to write a different ending to their stories. 18 months later, Kevin stood in the East Room of the White House while President Nixon placed the Medal of Honor around his neck. The president spoke about heroism and duty, about the finest traditions of American military service. But Kevin was thinking about Rodriguez, both of them, and Williams and Johnson and all the others who had made it home. Because sometimes, when everything goes wrong, one person decides to do what's right. The medal was heavy around his neck, heavier than the weight of a wounded man, heavier than the expectations of a grateful nation. Kevin accepted it with the same quiet dignity he would show 53 years later, when a police officer tasered him at a memorial to the very men he had fought beside. After the ceremony, a reporter asked Kevin what he planned to do with his life now that he was a war hero. "I'm not a hero," Kevin had replied. "I'm just a soldier who brought his brothers home. That's what we do for each other." But the reporter pressed, "What will you tell your children about this day?" Kevin looked at the medal in its blue presentation box, thinking about the weight of it, about the men who didn't come home to receive their own recognition, about the responsibility that came with being called a hero. "I'll tell them that courage isn't something you wear on your chest," he said finally. "It's something you carry in your heart, and that sometimes doing the right thing is the only thing that matters." 53 years later, lying on wet grass at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial with taser burns on his back, Kevin Wallace would remember those words. He would think about the weight of courage, about the responsibility of survival, about what it meant to be a hero in a world that sometimes forgot what heroism looked like. And he would understand that his fight for dignity and respect was far from over. The first video appeared on social media at 8:23 a.m., exactly 96 minutes after Officer Derek Walsh had tasered Kevin Wallace at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The footage was shaky, shot from a distance by the jogger who had stopped to witness what she thought would be a routine police interaction. Instead, she had captured something that would ignite a firestorm across the nation. The video was only 47 seconds long, but those 47 seconds contained everything America needed to see. An elderly black man kneeling peacefully at a war memorial, a police officer screaming threats, the bright flash of a taser, and the dignified way Kevin Wallace had risen from the ground afterward. The audio was clear enough to hear Walsh's words, "You old fool, this is a restricted area." Within 30 minutes, the video had been shared over 1,000 times. Within an hour, it had jumped from Twitter to Facebook to Instagram, picked up by accounts with names like @JusticeWatch and @VeteranRights and @PoliceAccountability. Each share carried its own commentary, its own outrage, its own demand for answers. By 10 a.m., the hashtag TaserVeteran was trending nationally. Detective Captain Maria Santos received the first call at 9:45 a.m. She was reviewing case files in her office at Metropolitan Police Headquarters when her phone rang with the tone that meant emergency, not the kind of emergency that required sirens and flashing lights, but the kind that could destroy careers and topple administrations.
Captain Santos, this is Chief Reynolds. I need you in my office. Now.
The urgency in Chief Reynolds' voice told Santos everything she needed to know. Something had gone wrong, something public, something that would require damage control. She grabbed her jacket and headed for the elevator, mentally preparing for whatever crisis awaited her. Chief Reynolds was standing behind his desk when she entered, his face grim as he watched something on his computer screen. He was a 25-year veteran of the force, a man who had seen every kind of scandal and crisis that could befall a police department. But the expression on his face suggested this was different. "Maria, tell me you've seen this," he said, turning the monitor toward her. Santos watched the video in silence, her heart sinking with each passing second. She'd seen bad police videos before. They all had, in the age of smartphones and social media. But this one was different. This wasn't a split-second decision in a dangerous situation, wasn't a case where reasonable people might disagree about tactics. This was an officer attacking an elderly man for the crime of existing while black at a war memorial. "Jesus Christ," she whispered when the video ended. "Who is the officer?" "Derek Walsh. 8 years on the force. Assigned to the Monument District. Clean record. No excessive force complaints. No disciplinary actions." Reynolds sat down heavily in his chair. "Until this morning, I would have said he was a solid cop." Santos was already thinking about damage control, about investigations and media responses, and all the machinery that would need to be set in motion. What do we know about the victim? That's where it gets complicated. Reynolds pulled up another screen, this one showing an official document. The man's name is Kevin Wallace, 78 years old, clean record, no arrests, no warrants. He paused, his finger hovering over a line of text. "Maria, he's a Vietnam veteran, Purple Heart recipient." The words hit Santos like a physical blow. A veteran. They'd tasered a veteran at a war memorial. The optics were beyond bad. They were catastrophic. "There's more," Reynolds continued. "Wallace filed a formal complaint an hour ago. He's requesting a full investigation, and he's retained legal counsel. Someone from the ACLU is already asking questions." Santos pulled up the video on her own phone, watching it again with the perspective of someone who would need to explain it to the media, to the mayor, to the public. Every second made it worse. The peaceful kneeling, the aggressive approach, the unnecessary force, the dignity of the victim. "Sir, we need to get ahead of this. Full investigation, immediate suspension of the officer, public statement acknowledging the incident." Reynolds nodded grimly. "Already in motion. Walsh has been suspended with pay pending investigation. But Maria, there's something else you need to know." He pulled up another document, this one with an official military letterhead. "I had someone in records run Wallace's name through the veteran database." Santos looked at the document and felt her blood turn cold. At the top, in bold letters, were 3 words that changed everything: Medal of Honor. "Are you telling me," Santos said slowly, "that Officer Walsh tasered a Medal of Honor recipient?" "That's exactly what I'm telling you." The silence in the office was deafening. Santos had been in law enforcement for 15 years, had handled gang shootings and political corruption and every kind of crisis that could befall a major city. But she had never dealt with anything like this. "How many people know about the medal?" she asked. "Right now, us, whoever Wallace told, and anyone who bothers to look up his military record. But it's public information, Maria. The moment someone connects those dots..." Santos didn't need him to finish the sentence. The moment the public learned that a police officer had tasered a Medal of Honor recipient, the outrage would be nuclear. Veterans groups, civil rights organizations, politicians from both parties, everyone would be calling for heads to roll. "We need to control the narrative," Santos said. "Full transparency, complete cooperation with any investigation, immediate disciplinary action." Already started. "But Maria, There's a problem with Walsh. What kind of problem? Reynolds pulled up another file on his computer. He's lawyered up, retained counsel, invoked his union rep, the whole 9 yards. He's not talking to anyone without his attorney present. Santos felt a familiar knot forming in her stomach. What's his story? According to his initial statement, he observed a suspicious individual loitering at the memorial. When he attempted to make contact, the individual became belligerent and refused to comply with lawful orders. Walsh felt threatened and used appropriate force to subdue the suspect. Appropriate force. Santos couldn't keep the incredulity out of her voice. He tasered a 78-year-old man who was kneeling at a war memorial. That's his story. His union rep is backing him up, saying Walsh followed department protocol for dealing with non-compliant subjects. Santos watched the video again, paying attention to Kevin Wallace's body language, his movements, his obvious lack of any threatening behavior. This is garbage, Chief. The video completely contradicts his statement. I know that, and you know that. But his attorney is already planting seeds about selective editing, about the video not showing the full context. They're going to fight this. While Santos and Reynolds were discussing damage control, the story was exploding across social media with the force of a digital wildfire. The original video had been viewed over 100,000 times, but it was the follow-up posts that were really driving engagement. A user named @VetAdvocate had posted a thread identifying Kevin Wallace and his military service record. The thread included photos of Wallace receiving his Purple Heart, documentation of his service in Vietnam, and a link to an old newspaper article about his Medal of Honor ceremony. Within minutes, the thread had been retweeted thousands of times. Fred. The elderly black man tasered by DC police is Kevin Wallace, a Vietnam veteran and Medal of Honor recipient. He served with distinction from 1965 to 1971 and was awarded our nation's highest military honor for extraordinary heroism. This is how we treat our heroes? The responses were immediate and furious, and the story jumped from social media to traditional news outlets as reporters scrambled to confirm the details and get statements from all parties involved. By noon, news vans were parked outside Metropolitan Police Headquarters. By 1 p.m., protesters had gathered on the steps, carrying signs that read "Honor Our Heroes" and "Justice for Kevin Wallace." By 2 p.m., members of Congress were issuing statements calling for a federal investigation. Meanwhile, Officer Derek Walsh sat in a conference room at his union headquarters, listening to his attorney explain the legal realities of his situation. The union rep, a veteran officer named Sergeant Mike Donovan, was trying to sound optimistic, but Walsh could see the concern in his eyes. The key is the use of force continuum, the attorney was saying. You perceived a threat. You gave commands. The subject was non-compliant. You followed your training. But the video, Walsh started. The video shows part of the interaction. It doesn't show what happened before you turned on your body camera. Doesn't show the full context of the encounter. We can work with that. Walsh watched his own body camera footage on the attorney's laptop, seeing himself approach Kevin Wallace, seeing the escalation that led to the taser deployment. On screen, it looked exactly like what it was, an unnecessary use of force against a peaceful elderly man. What about his military record? Walsh asked. I mean, if he's really a Medal of Honor recipient, that's irrelevant to the legal analysis, the attorney said firmly. You didn't know his military status when you made the decision to use force. You responded to the situation as you perceived it at the time. But Walsh knew it wasn't irrelevant to public perception, wasn't irrelevant to his career, wasn't irrelevant to the protesters gathering outside the building. He'd tasered a war hero, and no amount of legal maneuvering was going to change that fact. Sergeant Donovan's phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at it and his face went pale. Derek, we've got a problem. Channel 7 just interviewed Kevin Wallace. The interview is going live in 10 minutes. As news crews across the country prepared to broadcast Kevin Wallace's first public statement since the incident, Captain Santos gathered her staff for an emergency briefing. The room was packed with detectives, supervisors, and media relations personnel, all trying to manage a crisis that seemed to grow worse by the hour. "The interview airs in 8 minutes," Santos announced. "Whatever Wallace says, we need to be prepared to respond. Our statement emphasizes our commitment to a thorough investigation and our respect for all citizens, especially our veterans." Detective Lieutenant James Rodriguez raised his hand. "Captain, what if Wallace calls for Walsh's firing? What if he demands federal prosecution? Then we reiterate our commitment to following the investigation wherever it leads. We don't prejudge outcomes, but we also don't shy away from accountability." The room fell silent as someone turned on the television. Kevin Wallace appeared on screen, sitting in what looked like his living room, wearing a simple button-down shirt and speaking in the same calm, dignified voice that had characterized his encounter with Walsh. "Mr. Wallace," the reporter began, "thank you for speaking with us. Can you tell us what happened this morning at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial?" Kevin looked directly into the camera, his eyes clear and steady. "I went to honor my fallen brothers, as I do every month. I was placing a flag by the name of a young man who died in my arms 50 years ago. The next thing I knew, a police officer was screaming at me and pointing a weapon." "How did you feel when Officer Walsh tasered you?" Kevin was quiet for a moment, choosing his words carefully. "I felt sad, not angry, not afraid, sad, because in that moment, I realized that all the progress I thought we'd made, all the sacrifices my generation made for equality and justice, hadn't been enough. I was still being judged by the color of my skin instead of the content of my character." The interviewer pressed forward. "Mr. Wallace, we've confirmed that you're a Medal of Honor recipient. Were you surprised that Officer Walsh didn't recognize you?" "Officer Walsh had no way of knowing who I was," Kevin replied. "But that's exactly the point. He should have treated me with respect and dignity regardless of who I was, regardless of what I'd done or hadn't done. The badge is supposed to protect and serve all citizens, not just the ones who look like the officer wearing it." "What do you want to see happen to Officer Walsh?" Kevin looked thoughtful, the same expression he'd worn when facing down enemy fire 50 years earlier. "I want him to understand what he did wrong. I want him to learn from this experience. And I want to make sure that no other elderly person, no other veteran, no other human being is treated the way I was treated today." "Are you considering legal action?" "I'm considering what course of action will do the most good for the most people. This isn't about revenge or punishment. It's about justice and accountability, and making sure our police officers remember that their job is to serve all Americans with dignity and respect." As the interview ended, Captain Santos looked around the room at her officers and supervisors. Some looked angry, some looked embarrassed. All looked like they understood that their department was facing its biggest crisis in years. "Questions?" Santos asked. Detective Rodriguez spoke up again. "Captain, Wallace comes across as completely reasonable, completely sympathetic. The public is going to be on his side." "The public should be on his side," Santos replied. "He was wronged, and we need to make it right. The question is whether we can do that while maintaining the integrity of our investigation and our department." Outside the building, the crowd of protesters had grown larger and more organized. Veterans in uniform stood alongside civil rights activists, all united in their demand for justice. Their chants echoed through the streets. "Justice for Kevin, honor our heroes, accountability now." The system was responding, but not in the way Derek Walsh had hoped. Instead of closing ranks to protect one of their own, the machinery of justice was slowly, inevitably, turning toward accountability. The video was too clear, the victim too sympathetic, the officer's actions too obviously wrong. And at the center of it all was Kevin Wallace, who had faced down enemy fire in Vietnam and police brutality in Washington with the same quiet dignity, the same unshakable belief that America could be better than its worst moments. The system was about to be tested in ways it hadn't been tested in years, and for the first time in a long time, it looked like justice might actually prevail. The call came at 0600 hours sharp, military precision cutting through the early morning quiet of General Patricia Martinez's Pentagon office. As the Army's highest-ranking Hispanic woman and a veteran of 3 combat deployments, General Martinez was accustomed to crisis calls, but this one was different. "General, this is Colonel Thompson from Public Affairs. Ma'am, we have a situation involving one of our Medal of Honor recipients." Martinez set down her coffee and pulled up the secure military database on her computer. "Which recipient, Colonel?" "Kevin Wallace, Medal of Honor, Vietnam War." "Ma'am, he was attacked by police yesterday while visiting the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The incident was recorded and it's gone viral." General Martinez found Wallace's file and felt her blood pressure spike as she read through his service record. 3 tours in Vietnam, Purple Heart with 2 oak leaf clusters, Bronze Star with V device, and the Medal of Honor for single-handedly saving 47 men under impossible odds. "Colonel, connect me directly with Secretary Austin's office and get me everything we have on this incident. I want a full briefing in 30 minutes. While General Martinez was mobilizing the full weight of the Pentagon's response, a different kind of mobilization was happening in VFW halls, American Legion posts, and veteran gathering places across the country. The veteran community had always been a tight-knit brotherhood, bound together by shared sacrifice and mutual respect. When one of their own was wronged, especially a Medal of Honor recipient, the response was swift and unified. At VFW post-1954, in Kevin Wallace's hometown of Detroit, Commander Ernest Washington called an emergency meeting. Washington had served 2 tours in Iraq and had known about Kevin Wallace's presence in their community for years, though Kevin himself rarely attended meetings or spoke about his service. "Brothers and sisters," Washington addressed the packed hall, "one of our own has been dishonored. Not just any veteran, but a Medal of Honor recipient. Kevin Wallace saved 47 American lives in Vietnam, and yesterday he was tasered by a police officer for the crime of honoring our fallen." The room erupted in angry voices. Veterans of Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, all united in their outrage, but Washington raised his hand for silence. "Anger is appropriate, but action is what we need. I'm calling for a nationwide veteran response. Every post, every chapter, every veteran organization needs to know what happened to Kevin Wallace. We don't abandon our brothers, and we damn sure don't let them be attacked without consequences." Within hours, the Veteran Response Network was activated across the country. The veterans of foreign wars issued a national statement. The American Legion called for a federal investigation. Vietnam Veterans of America organized protests in 12 major cities. The Military Order of the Purple Heart demanded Officer Walsh's immediate termination. But it was the response from Kevin's old unit that carried the most emotional weight. Master Sergeant retired, Robert Doc Martinez, had been the medic Kevin saved during that hellish day at Firebase Charlie 53 years earlier. Now 71 years old and living in San Antonio, Martinez watched the viral video with tears streaming down his face. Martinez picked up his phone and started making calls. Within 2 hours, he had contacted 8 of the men Kevin had carried to safety that day in Vietnam. Men who were now grandfathers, retired teachers, small business owners, and community leaders. Men who owed their lives to the quiet courage of Kevin Wallace. "Listen," Martinez told each of them, "our sergeant needs us. The man who saved our lives is being attacked, and we can't let that stand." By Wednesday evening, 6 of the survivors of Firebase Charlie were on planes to Washington, D.C. They were coming to stand with Kevin Wallace, to tell the world exactly who they were defending, to put faces and voices to the 47 lives that had been saved by one man's extraordinary courage. The media was quick to pick up on the gathering veteran support, with major networks running segments about Medal of Honor recipients and the significance of attacks on America's most decorated heroes. Meanwhile, at the Pentagon, General Martinez was coordinating a response that would send a clear message about how the military protects its own. She had spent the morning on phone calls with the Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the White House Liaison Office. "Colonel Thompson," she called to her aide, "I want you to coordinate with the Medal of Honor Society. Every living recipient needs to be contacted. I want them to know what happened to Kevin Wallace and I want them to know the military stands behind him. Yes, ma'am. What kind of response are we authorizing? Full support. If Mr. Wallace wants legal assistance, we provide it. If he wants military honors at any public appearance, we provide them. If he wants the full weight of the Pentagon behind him, he's got it. General Martinez pulled up Kevin's service record again, reading through the citation for his Medal of Honor. The language was formal, military, but it couldn't capture the reality of what he had done. The split-second decisions, the physical courage, the absolute refusal to abandon his brothers. Colonel, I want you to contact Kevin Wallace directly. Tell him that the United States Army stands with him and ask him what he needs from us. Ma'am, what if he doesn't want military involvement? What if he prefers to handle this as a civilian matter? General Martinez considered the question. Then we respect his wishes, but we make damn sure he knows that his military family hasn't forgotten him, hasn't abandoned him, and will never let him stand alone. The Pentagon's support became public knowledge when Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin issued a rare personal statement. The attack on Medal of Honor recipient Kevin Wallace is an attack on every American who has worn the uniform in service to our nation. Mr. Wallace exemplifies the highest ideals of military service, and the disrespect shown to him at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial is unacceptable. The Department of Defense stands fully behind Mr. Wallace and calls for swift justice in this matter. The statement was unprecedented in its directness and personal tone. Secretaries of Defense rarely inserted themselves into local police matters, but the combination of Kevin's service record and the obvious injustice of his treatment had moved the Pentagon to take an unusually public stance. The ripple effects were immediate. Veterans Affairs Secretary Denny McDonough announced that the VA would provide full legal and medical support to Kevin Wallace. The White House issued a statement saying President Biden had personally called Kevin to express his support and outrage over the incident. But perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source, the Congressional Medal of Honor Society. The society, which represents all living Medal of Honor recipients, issued a joint statement signed by all 67 surviving recipients. We stand united in support of our brother Kevin Wallace. The Medal of Honor represents the highest ideals of service, sacrifice, and courage. When one of our recipients is attacked for exercising his constitutional rights, when he is judged by the color of his skin rather than the content of his character, it is an attack on everything the medal represents. We call for justice, accountability, and the respect that every American veteran deserves. The statement was read aloud on the floor of the House of Representatives by Congressman John Lewis's successor, who had sponsored legislation to protect veteran rights. It was broadcast on every major news network. It was shared millions of times on social media. Suddenly, Officer Derek Walsh wasn't just facing criticism from random internet users or civil rights activists. He was facing the unified opposition of America's most decorated heroes, the Pentagon, the White House, and the entire veteran community. Inside the Metropolitan Police Department, the pressure was becoming unbearable. Chief Reynolds had fielded calls from senators, representatives, military officials, and veteran organizations. The mayor's office was demanding answers. The Justice Department was opening a civil rights investigation. Captain Santos called an emergency meeting of the investigative team. "Where do we stand on the investigation?" she asked Detective Lieutenant Rodriguez. "It's pretty clear-cut, Captain. The video speaks for itself. Wallace was engaged in lawful activity, posed no threat, and was subjected to unnecessary force. Wallace's use of the taser was completely unjustified." What about Walsh's statement? Full of holes. He claims Wallace was acting suspiciously, but the video shows him kneeling peacefully. He claims Wallace was non-compliant, but the audio shows Wallace being respectful throughout. His story doesn't match the evidence. Santos nodded grimly. Recommendations: termination for excessive use of force, criminal charges for assault under color of authority, civil rights violation, referral to federal prosecutors. The room was quiet as the weight of the recommendations settled in. They were talking about ending a police officer's career, potentially sending him to prison, destroying his life. But they were also talking about justice for a man who had served his country with honor and been repaid with humiliation and violence. "Any dissenting views?" Santos asked. The room remained silent. "All right, I'll brief the chief this afternoon." While the official investigation was reaching its inevitable conclusion, a different kind of truth was emerging in the court of public opinion. Social media had become a platform for sharing stories about Kevin Wallace, about Medal of Honor recipients, about the treatment of black veterans throughout American history. A thread by military historian Dr. Sarah Chen went viral. Fred, Kevin Wallace's story is part of a longer, painful history of black veterans being denied the respect they earned through service. From the Tuskegee Airmen to the Buffalo Soldiers to Vietnam vets like Wallace, black military heroes have faced discrimination both in service and after returning home. The thread detailed decades of systemic racism in the military and veteran affairs, but it also highlighted the extraordinary heroism of black service members who had fought for a country that didn't always fight for them. Kevin Wallace saved 47 lives in Vietnam and came home to a country that still saw his skin color before his service record. Today's incident at the memorial is a reminder that we still have work to do. 1515. The thread was shared by celebrities, politicians, and millions of ordinary Americans who were learning about the complex history of race and military service in America. But perhaps the most powerful social media moment came from an unexpected source, Private First Class Rodriguez's daughter. Maria Elena Rodriguez was now a successful lawyer in Los Angeles, named after the father she had never met. She had grown up hearing stories about the brave sergeant who had carried her wounded father to safety in Vietnam, who had made it possible for her to exist. "My father died in a car accident when I was 2, she posted on Instagram, alongside a photo of her father in uniform. "But he lived long enough to tell me about the man who saved his life in Vietnam. Kevin Wallace carried my wounded father across a battlefield under enemy fire. Because of Kevin's courage, my father came home from war. Because my father came home, I exist. Today I learned that Kevin Wallace was attacked by police for honoring fallen veterans. This is how we treat the man who made my life possible." The post was shared by tens of thousands of people, many adding their own stories of veterans and their families, of service members who had been saved by the courage of others, of the ripple effects of heroism across generations. As Thursday morning dawned, the truth about Kevin Wallace was no longer in question. The nation knew who he was, what he had done, and how he had been wronged. The veteran community had rallied around him. The military establishment had endorsed him. The political system was demanding justice for him. Officer Derek Walsh was about to discover that attacking a Medal of Honor recipient wasn't just morally wrong. It was a career-ending mistake that would follow him for the rest of his life. But Kevin Wallace, the man at the center of it all, remained focused on something larger than personal vindication. He was thinking about the 47 men whose lives he had saved, about the thousands of names carved into the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, about the idea that America could still be a place where service was honored and justice was possible. The truth had emerged, and it was more powerful than any lie, more enduring than any attempt to cover it up, more compelling than any narrative designed to protect the system at the expense of the individual. Kevin Wallace was about to become the face of veteran dignity, military heroism, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. And the country was about to learn what happened when you attacked one of its most decorated heroes. The termination letter was delivered to Officer Derek Walsh at exactly 3:17 p.m. on Friday afternoon, 72 hours after he had tasered Kevin Wallace at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. The document was brief, clinical, and devastating. Officer Derek Walsh, Badge 2847, is hereby terminated from the Metropolitan Police Department, effective immediately, for violation of Department Policy 901.07, Use of Force, Policy 302, Professional Standards, and Policy 1020.05, Discrimination and Bias-Based Policing. This termination is based on your actions on November 14, 2023, involving the unlawful use of force against a civilian engaged in lawful activity. Walsh read the letter 3 times, his hands trembling slightly, as the full weight of his situation became clear. 8 years of service, gone. His pension, forfeit. His career in law enforcement, over. His reputation, destroyed. Across the desk from him sat his union representative, Sergeant Mike Donovan, whose expression had grown increasingly grim throughout the week as the evidence mounted against Walsh. Donovan had seen officers survive shootings, corruption charges, and brutality allegations. But he had never seen anything like the unified opposition that had formed against Derek Walsh. "Derek, I have to be honest with you," Donovan said quietly. "This is the fastest termination I've ever seen. Usually these things drag out for months with appeals and hearings, but the video evidence is too clear, the victim is too sympathetic, and the public pressure is too intense." Walsh looked up from the termination letter, his eyes hollow. "What about the union? What about due process? The union will still represent you in any criminal proceedings. But Derek, we can't defend the indefensible. You tasered a Medal of Honor recipient for visiting a war memorial. There's no procedural defense for that." The criminal charges had been filed that morning. Assault under color of authority, a federal civil rights violation that carried up to 10 years in prison. The U.S. Attorney's Office had fast-tracked the case, unusual for a first-time offense, but entirely predictable given the national attention and the victim's status. Assistant U.S. Attorney Jennifer Morrison had personally taken the case, viewing it as a clear-cut example of police overreach that demanded federal intervention. She had spent the morning reviewing the evidence, the video, Walsh's body camera footage, witness statements, and Kevin Wallace's impeccable character references. "This isn't a complicated case," Morrison told her staff. "Officer Walsh used excessive force against a citizen who was engaged in constitutionally protected activity. The fact that the victim is a Medal of Honor recipient makes it worse, but the underlying crime would be the same regardless." The federal charges sent shockwaves through police departments across the country. Officers who might have remained silent in other circumstances began speaking out against Walsh's actions, understanding that defending him would be career suicide. At the Metropolitan Police Department, Chief Reynolds called an all-hands meeting to address the crisis that had engulfed his department. The auditorium was packed with officers, supervisors, and civilian staff, all trying to understand how their department had become the center of a national scandal. "I want to be absolutely clear," Reynolds announced to the assembled crowd. "Officer Walsh's actions do not represent the values of this department or the standards we expect from our officers. We have terminated his employment, and we fully support the federal prosecution of this case." Detective Captain Santos, who had been leading the internal investigation, stepped to the podium. The investigation revealed a pattern of poor judgment and biased policing that should have been addressed earlier. "We failed Kevin Wallace, and we failed the community we serve." The admission of institutional failure was unprecedented, but Santos knew that half measures wouldn't be sufficient given the magnitude of the crisis. The department needed to demonstrate that it was capable of genuine reform, not just damage control. Effective immediately, Reynolds continued, "We are implementing new training requirements for all officers, bias awareness, de-escalation techniques, and proper interaction with veterans and elderly citizens. We are also establishing a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints and recommend discipline." The reforms were comprehensive and immediate. Body cameras would be mandatory for all interactions, not just arrests. Use of force reports would be reviewed by independent supervisors. Any complaint involving veterans would trigger an automatic investigation by Internal Affairs. But the most significant change was cultural. The Walsh incident had forced every officer in the department to confront the reality that their actions were being watched, recorded, and judged by a public that would no longer accept police misconduct as inevitable. Officer Sarah Chen, a 5-year veteran who had watched the Walsh video with horror, raised her hand during the meeting. "Chief, what about officers who witness misconduct? What are our obligations?" Reynolds looked directly at her. "Your obligation is to intervene, to report, and to remember that your oath is to protect and serve all citizens, not to protect bad cops." Officer Walsh's actions were witnessed by other officers who did nothing to stop him. That failure is also being investigated. The message was clear. The blue wall of silence that had protected bad officers for decades was being dismantled, replaced by a culture of accountability and transparency. While the police department was grappling with institutional reform, Derek Walsh was confronting the personal consequences of his actions. The media attention had made him unemployable in law enforcement, and the federal charges meant he faced the possibility of prison time. His wife, Karen, had initially stood by him, believing his version of events. But as the evidence mounted and Kevin Wallace's story became known, she began to question everything she thought she knew about her husband. "Derek," she said one evening as they sat in their kitchen, avoiding the news crews camped outside their house, "I watched that video again. I listened to what you said to that man. That's not the person I married." Walsh stared at his hands, unable to meet her eyes. "I was just doing my job, Karen. I saw a suspicious person, and I responded according to my training." "Your training told you to taser a 78-year-old man who was kneeling at a war memorial?" The question hung in the air between them, unanswered and unanswerable. Walsh had spent 3 days trying to justify his actions, first to his superiors, then to his attorney, then to himself. But every justification crumbled when confronted with the simple truth. He had attacked an innocent man because of racial bias and unchecked authority. "I don't know," Walsh finally admitted. "I don't know why I did it." The admission was the first honest thing he had said since the incident, and it marked the beginning of a reckoning that would be far more painful than any legal consequence. Meanwhile, Kevin Wallace was dealing with his own form of public attention. Though his experience was vastly different from Walsh's, veterans organizations were asking him to speak at events. Civil rights groups wanted him to join their causes. Media outlets were requesting interviews. But Kevin remained focused on the larger purpose that had driven him throughout his life: service to others and faith in American ideals. He agreed to meet with Chief Reynolds personally, not to demand revenge or punishment, but to discuss how the police department could better serve all citizens. The meeting took place in Reynolds' office, with Captain Santos and several community leaders in attendance. "Chief Reynolds?" Kevin said, his voice carrying the same dignity that had characterized his response throughout the crisis. "I appreciate the steps your department has taken, but I want to talk about something more important than punishment." Reynolds leaned forward, genuinely interested in what this remarkable man had to say. "I want to talk about healing, about how we move forward from this incident in a way that makes our community stronger." Kevin had spent the week thinking about the Firebase Charlie incident from 50 years earlier, about the men he had saved and the bonds that had formed under fire. He understood that crisis could either divide people or bring them together, depending on how leaders responded to it. "I'd like to propose a partnership," Kevin continued, "between the veteran community and your police department. Officers could visit the memorial regularly, not to patrol it, but to understand it. They could meet with veterans, hear our stories, learn about our service." Santos made notes as Kevin spoke, recognizing the wisdom in his approach. Instead of demanding punishment, he was offering redemption. Instead of perpetuating division, he was proposing unity. "Mr. Wallace," Reynolds said, "I think that's an excellent idea. We would be honored to participate in such a program." "There's one more thing," Kevin added. "I'd like Officer Walsh to be part of it when he's ready, not as a police officer, but as someone who needs to understand what he did and why it was wrong." The suggestion stunned everyone in the room. Kevin Wallace, the victim of Walsh's attack, was offering his attacker a path to redemption. "Sir," Reynolds said carefully, "Officer Walsh is facing federal charges. I'm not sure." "I understand the legal process has to run its course," Kevin replied. "But when it's over, regardless of the outcome, I think Officer Walsh and I need to have a conversation, not for his benefit or mine, but for the benefit of everyone who needs to believe that people can change, that mistakes can be learning opportunities, that America can still be a place where redemption is possible." The offer of forgiveness was as powerful as any demand for punishment could have been. It demonstrated the depth of Kevin's character and his commitment to principles larger than personal grievance. News of Kevin's proposal spread quickly, generating a new wave of media coverage that focused not on anger and division, but on the possibility of healing and growth. Editorial writers praised his magnanimity. Religious leaders cited him as an example of forgiveness in action. Military commanders pointed to him as embodying the highest ideals of service. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from Derek Walsh himself. When his attorney told him about Kevin's offer to include him in the veteran education program, Walsh broke down completely. For the first time since the incident, he allowed himself to fully comprehend what he had done and who he had done it to. "I attacked a hero," he said through his tears. "I attacked a man who saved lives while I was destroying one." His attorney, uncomfortable with emotional displays, tried to redirect the conversation to legal strategy, but Walsh was no longer interested in defending his actions. He was interested in understanding how he had become the kind of person who could taser an elderly veteran for visiting a war memorial. "I want to apologize," Walsh told his attorney, "not for legal reasons, not for public relations, but because it's the right thing to do. Derek, I strongly advise against any public statements until after the criminal proceedings." "I don't care about the legal strategy," Walsh interrupted. "I care about doing what's right for the first time since this whole thing started." Against his attorney's advice, Walsh contacted Kevin Wallace directly, asking for a private meeting. Kevin agreed, understanding that reconciliation required conversation, that healing demanded human contact. They met in a small conference room at the Veterans Center, where Kevin volunteered, neutral ground where both men could speak honestly without the pressure of media attention or legal proceedings. Walsh was nervous, uncertain how to begin. Kevin waited patiently, the same way he had waited in ambush positions 50 years earlier, understanding that some things couldn't be rushed. "Mr. Wallace," Walsh finally said, "I don't know how to apologize for what I did to you. I don't know how to explain it, or justify it, or make it right." Kevin studied the younger man's face, seeing genuine remorse mixed with confusion and shame. "Son, sometimes the best apology is understanding why an apology is necessary. I keep asking myself why I did it. Why I saw you as a threat when you were clearly just paying your respects. Why I escalated instead of de-escalating. Why I used force against someone who posed no danger. And what answers have you found?" Walsh was quiet for a long moment. "I think I was scared, not of you, but of admitting that I might be wrong, that my assumptions might be based on prejudice instead of evidence, that the badge doesn't make me automatically right." Kevin nodded slowly. "That's a start. The badge is supposed to be about service, not power, about protecting people, not controlling them. How do I move forward from this? How do I become better?" Kevin thought about the question, remembering his own moments of doubt and failure, the times when he had fallen short of his own ideals. The same way everyone gets better, by listening, by learning, by accepting that growth requires admitting you were wrong. The conversation lasted 2 hours, covering topics that ranged from police training to racial bias, to the nature of heroism and service. By the end, both men understood that healing was possible, that redemption was available to anyone willing to do the hard work of genuine change. As they prepared to leave, Kevin made one final offer. "Derek, when you're ready, when the legal proceedings are over, I'd like you to visit the memorial with me. I'd like to tell you about some of the men whose names are on that wall, about what they fought for and what they died believing in." Walsh nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'd be honored, sir." The reckoning was complete, but it had taken a form that neither man could have anticipated. Justice had been served through accountability and consequences, but healing had begun through forgiveness and the possibility of redemption. Derek Walsh would face the legal consequences of his actions as he should, but he would also have the opportunity to become better than his worst moment, to learn from his mistakes, to contribute to a more just and equitable society. And Kevin Wallace, once again, had shown that true heroism isn't just about saving lives under fire, but about saving souls through compassion, about building bridges where others see only divisions, about believing in the possibility that America can always be better than it is. The marble corridors of the Rayburn House office building had witnessed countless moments of American history, but few as powerful as the one unfolding on December 3rd. Kevin Wallace walked slowly through the hallways, his weathered hands steady despite the magnitude of what lay ahead. At 78, he was about to address a joint congressional hearing on veteran treatment and police accountability, a hearing that existed because of what had happened to him at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial 3 weeks earlier. Accompanying Kevin was a delegation that read like a roll call of American military history: General Patricia Martinez, Secretary of Veterans Affairs Denny McDonough, and 6 of the men whose lives Kevin had saved at Firebase Charlie 53 years ago. Doc Martinez, now using a walking cane but still carrying himself with military bearing, stayed close to Kevin's side. "You ready for this, Sarge?" Martinez asked quietly as they approached the hearing room. Kevin adjusted his tie, the same one he had worn to receive his Medal of Honor from President Nixon in "I've been ready for this conversation my whole life, Doc. Just never thought it would take a taser to start it." The hearing room was packed beyond capacity. The witness table sat before a dais where 24 members of Congress, both Democrats and Republicans, waited to hear Kevin's testimony. Behind him, the gallery was filled with veterans, civil rights leaders, police officials, and citizens who had traveled from across the country to witness this moment. Congressman James Clyburn, the committee chairman, called the hearing to order. "We convene today to examine the treatment of veterans by law enforcement agencies and to consider legislative remedies to prevent future incidents like the one that brought us together. Our first witness is Medal of Honor recipient Kevin Wallace." Kevin rose slowly and approached the microphone, his military posture evident despite his age. He had testified before Congress once before, in 1972, urging support for Vietnam veterans returning home to an indifferent nation. 51 years later, he was back to address a different but related injustice. "Mr. Wallace," Chairman Clyburn began, "thank you for being here today. Would you please tell the committee, in your own words, what happened to you at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial on November 14th? Kevin looked directly at the committee members, his voice steady and clear despite the weight of the moment. "I went to honor my fallen brothers, as I have done every month for 20 years. I was kneeling beside the name of Sergeant Michael Rodriguez, a young man who died in my arms in Vietnam, when Officer Derek Walsh approached me." The room was absolutely silent as Kevin recounted the events, his testimony made more powerful by its understatement and dignity. He didn't embellish or dramatize. He simply told the truth about what it felt like to be judged by the color of his skin while honoring men who had died for American ideals. Officer Walsh saw an elderly black man and assumed I didn't belong at a war memorial. Kevin continued, "He didn't ask for identification. He didn't inquire about my purpose there. He simply decided that my presence was suspicious and my dignity was expendable." Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez leaned forward in her chair. "Mr. Wallace, how did you feel when Officer Walsh tasered you?" Kevin paused, choosing his words carefully. "Congresswoman, I felt sad, not angry, not afraid. Sad, because in that moment, I realized that all the progress I thought we had made as a nation, all the sacrifices my generation made for civil rights and equality, hadn't been enough to prevent an elderly veteran from being attacked for visiting a memorial to his fallen brothers." The gallery erupted in quiet murmurs of agreement, quickly hushed by the chairman's gavel. Congressman Dan Crenshaw, a Navy SEAL veteran who had lost an eye in Afghanistan, addressed Kevin with visible emotion. "Mr. Wallace, as a veteran myself, I want to apologize for what happened to you. It's unconscionable that any veteran, especially a Medal of Honor recipient, should be treated with such disrespect." Congressman Kevin replied, "I appreciate your words, but this isn't just about me, and it's not just about veterans. This is about how we treat all our citizens, especially those who don't have the privilege of recognition or the protection of public attention." The answer was quintessentially Kevin Wallace, deflecting personal sympathy to focus on larger systemic issues. Senator Tammy Duckworth, a Purple Heart recipient who had lost both legs in Iraq, joined the hearing via video link from the Senate. "Mr. Wallace, you've become a symbol of dignity under attack. What message do you want to send to other veterans who might face similar treatment? Kevin straightened in his chair, and for a moment the committee could see the young sergeant who had saved 47 lives under fire. Senator, I want them to know that their service matters, that their sacrifice was meaningful, and that they should never have to apologize for existing in the country they fought to defend. Congressman Jim Jordan, known for his aggressive questioning style, took a different approach with Kevin. Mr. Wallace, some people might say that this incident has been blown out of proportion, that mistakes happen in police work. How do you respond to that? Kevin looked directly at Jordan, his expression neither defensive nor confrontational. Congressman, if Officer Walsh had mistaken me for a security threat and approached me respectfully, asked for identification, treated me as a fellow human being, there would be no incident to discuss. The problem wasn't a mistake in judgment. It was a failure to see my humanity. But don't you think one officer's poor decision reflects poorly on all law enforcement? Sir, I believe one officer's poor decision reflects the need for better training, better accountability, and better understanding of the communities police officers serve. I don't blame all officers for Officer Walsh's actions, but I do expect all officers to learn from his mistakes. The exchange demonstrated Kevin's ability to address criticism without losing his composure or his focus on constructive solutions. Senator Tim Scott, the ranking Republican on the Senate subcommittee, asked the question many were thinking. Mr. Wallace, you've shown remarkable forgiveness toward Officer Walsh, even offering to include him in veteran education programs. Why? Kevin was quiet for a moment, thinking about his answer. Senator, I learned something in Vietnam that has stayed with me for 50 years. Hatred and revenge don't heal wounds, they create new ones. If Officer Walsh can learn from this experience, if he can become someone who treats all citizens with dignity and respect, then something good will have come from something bad. But shouldn't there be consequences for his actions? There should be, and there are. Officer Walsh lost his job and faces federal charges, but punishment without education is just revenge. I believe in justice, but I also believe in redemption. The hearing room erupted in spontaneous applause, quickly gave down by Chairman Clyburn. Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley shifted the focus to policy solutions. Mr. Wallace, what specific changes would you like to see in police training and veteran relations? Kevin pulled out a folded piece of paper, notes he had made over the past weeks while thinking about this exact question. First, every police academy should include mandatory training on veteran identification and interaction. Officers should understand that veterans may carry themselves differently, may respond to authority based on their military experience, and deserve special consideration for their service. He continued reading from his notes. Second, every police department should establish partnerships with local veteran organizations. Officers should visit memorials, attend veteran events, and understand the sacrifices that veterans have made for this country. Third, Kevin said, looking up from his notes, we need accountability measures that go beyond individual punishment. When an officer makes a mistake, like Officer Walsh did, the entire department should examine its training, its culture, and its commitment to serving all citizens equally. Congressman Clyburn nodded approvingly. Mr. Wallace, Congress is considering the Veterans Dignity Act, which would make attacking a veteran while they're engaged in memorial activities a federal hate crime. Do you support this legislation? Kevin considered the question carefully. Mr. Chairman, I support any measure that protects veterans from discrimination and violence. But I would expand that protection to include all citizens engaged in constitutionally protected activities. The memorial belongs to all Americans, not just veterans. The response was classic Kevin Wallace, accepting support while insisting on broader principles of justice and equality. As the hearing continued, other witnesses testified about the broader issues of police-veteran relations. Dr. Sarah Chen, the military historian whose viral Twitter thread had helped educate the public about Black veteran experiences, presented research on the historical treatment of minority veterans. The data shows that Black veterans are disproportionately likely to experience negative interactions with police. Dr. Chen testified, despite their service to the country, they continue to face the same racial profiling and bias that affects other African Americans. Police Chief Maria Santos testified about the reforms implemented in the Metropolitan Police Department since the Walsh incident. We've completely overhauled our training program, implemented mandatory body cameras for all interactions, and established a civilian oversight board with real authority to investigate complaints. But it was the testimony of Doc Martinez, speaking for the men Kevin had saved in Vietnam, that provided the emotional climax of the hearing. Honorable members of Congress, Martinez began, his voice strong. Despite his age, Kevin Wallace saved my life 53 years ago when I was 19 years old and bleeding to death in a foreign country. He carried me across a battlefield under enemy fire because he believed every American life was worth saving. Martinez paused, composing himself. Last month, Kevin was attacked by a police officer for the crime of honoring fallen Americans. The same hands that pulled me from the jaws of death were handcuffed for visiting a memorial to his brothers in arms. The gallery was completely silent, many members wiping away tears. Kevin Wallace represents the best of America: service, sacrifice, dignity, and forgiveness. If we can't protect a Medal of Honor recipient visiting a war memorial, then we've lost our way as a nation. Martinez concluded with a direct challenge to the committee. You have the power to ensure that no veteran, no citizen, no human being is ever treated the way Kevin Wallace was treated. The question is whether you have the courage to use that power. As the formal testimony concluded, Chairman Clyburn made an announcement that surprised everyone in the room. Mr. Wallace, on behalf of the House of Representatives, I want to present you with this resolution, passed unanimously yesterday, honoring your service to our nation and your dignity in the face of injustice. Kevin stood to receive the resolution, and the entire hearing room rose with him in sustained applause. Veterans saluted, civilians clapped, and even the most partisan members of Congress stood united in recognition of what Kevin Wallace represented. But Kevin's final statement was the moment that would be remembered long after the applause died down. Honorable members of Congress, distinguished guests, fellow Americans, Kevin began, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had earned the right to speak truth to power. I came here today not seeking sympathy or special treatment, but asking for something more important, the promise that America will live up to its ideals. He looked directly at each member of the committee as he spoke. Every veteran who served this country did so believing in the promise of America, that all people are created equal, that justice and liberty are not privileges but rights, that service to others is the highest calling. When Officer Walsh tasered me at that memorial, he didn't just attack one elderly veteran, he attacked the promise itself. The idea that America is a place where service is honored and dignity is respected. Kevin's voice grew stronger as he reached his conclusion. But promises can be kept or broken based on the choices we make. You have the power to choose whether Kevin Wallace's story ends with injustice or transformation, with division or unity, with despair or hope. I challenge you to choose transformation. I challenge you to choose unity. I challenge you to choose hope. Because 50 years after I carried wounded Americans to safety in Vietnam, I still believe in the America they were fighting for. The question is whether you believe in it too. The hearing room erupted in the longest standing ovation in congressional history, lasting nearly 5 minutes, as members, guests, and gallery participants recognized that they had witnessed something extraordinary. Not just testimony, but a call to national conscience that transcended party lines and political calculations. As Kevin Wallace walked out of the hearing room, accompanied by the men whose lives he had saved and the nation whose conscience he had stirred, it was clear that his story had become America's story, a reminder that heroism isn't just about battlefield courage, but about the daily choice to believe in justice, dignity, and the possibility that we can always be better than we are. The congressional hearing was over, but Kevin Wallace's real work, the work of healing a nation and honoring the promise of America, was just beginning. 3 weeks after his congressional testimony, Kevin Wallace stood at the entrance to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. But this time, he wasn't alone. Behind him stretched a procession that would have seemed impossible, Just a month earlier, current and former military officers, police chiefs from 12 major cities, veteran organization leaders, civil rights activists, and hundreds of ordinary citizens who had come to witness what many were calling a moment of national healing. The December morning was crisp and clear. The kind of weather that made the black granite wall seem to absorb and reflect light simultaneously. Kevin wore his Medal of Honor for only the second time in public since receiving it 52 years earlier, not as a symbol of his own heroism, but as a reminder of what the memorial represented and why it needed to be protected for all Americans. Beside him walked Chief Reynolds, who had personally requested to accompany Kevin on his return to the place where his officer had committed such a grave injustice. Behind them came Doc Martinez and 5 other Firebase Charlie survivors, men who had traveled from across the country to stand with their sergeant one more time. But perhaps the most remarkable presence in the procession was Derek Walsh himself. Walsh had completed his federal sentence, 6 months in minimum security prison, 2 years of probation, and 500 hours of community service with veteran organizations. The judge had been lenient, influenced by Kevin's testimony about redemption and Walsh's own genuine remorse. But the real punishment had been the 3 months Walsh spent in federal custody, surrounded by veterans who knew exactly what he had done. In prison, Walsh had been forced to confront the full weight of his actions, not through violence or intimidation, but through quiet conversations with men who had served their country and couldn't understand how anyone could attack Kevin Wallace, a former Marine named Carlos Rodriguez, no relation to the Rodriguez whose name was on the wall, had taken it upon himself to educate Walsh about military service, veteran culture, and the meaning of sacrifice. "You want to understand what you did?" Rodriguez had asked Walsh during their first conversation in the prison yard. "You attacked a man who saved 47 lives under enemy fire. You attacked someone who volunteered to die for strangers. You attacked the best of America and called it suspicious." The education had been painful but transformative. Walsh began reading military history, studying the Vietnam War, learning about the experiences of black veterans who had served with distinction only to face discrimination at home. He wrote letters to veteran organizations, apologizing not just for his actions, but for his ignorance. Most importantly, he wrote to Kevin Wallace every month, not expecting forgiveness, but seeking understanding. Kevin had responded to every letter. Now, as the procession approached the memorial wall, Walsh walked separately from the main group, unsure of his place in this moment of reconciliation. He had asked Kevin's permission to attend, knowing that his presence might be seen as inappropriate or offensive. But Kevin had insisted he come, understanding that healing required the presence of both victim and perpetrator. The ceremony began with a prayer from Chaplain Colonel Robert Hayes, a Vietnam veteran who had served alongside Kevin in different units, but the same war. "We gather today not to relitigate the past, but to recommit ourselves to the ideals that these names represent: service, sacrifice, and the belief that all Americans deserve dignity and respect." General Patricia Martinez, representing the Pentagon, spoke next. Kevin Wallace's experience here 3 weeks ago was an attack, not just on one veteran, but on everything this memorial stands for. Today, we reclaim this sacred space as a place of honor, reflection, and unity. But it was Kevin's own words that transformed the gathering from a media event into something deeper and more meaningful. 52 years ago, Kevin began, standing before the panel where Rodriguez's name was carved. "I made 7 trips across a battlefield to carry wounded Americans to safety. Each trip should have been my last, but I kept going because I believed every life was worth saving. Every American deserved to come home." He paused, looking at the crowd that had gathered to hear him speak. 3 weeks ago, I was attacked at this very spot for the crime of honoring my fallen brothers. But today, I'm not here to talk about that attack. I'm here to talk about what comes after the attack. The choice between bitterness and hope, between division and unity, between revenge and redemption. Kevin turned to face Derek Walsh, who stood apart from the crowd, his head bowed in shame and remorse. "Derek, would you please join me?" The request sent a shock through the assembled crowd. Many had come expecting condemnation of Walsh, not an invitation for him to participate in the ceremony. But Kevin's gesture was deliberate and powerful, a demonstration that reconciliation required courage from both sides. Walsh approached slowly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention but committed to the process Kevin had outlined in their correspondence. When he reached the wall, Kevin placed his hand on Rodriguez's name and asked Walsh to do the same. "Derek," Kevin said quietly, his voice carrying across the silent gathering, "tell them about Michael Rodriguez." Walsh had spent months learning about the men whose names were on the wall, particularly the one Kevin visited most often. Sergeant Michael J. Rodriguez was 19 years old when he died at Firebase Charlie on March 15. He was from East Los Angeles, the son of immigrants who believed in the American dream. He volunteered for point duty because he was the best shot in his squad, and he died protecting his brothers. Walsh's voice grew stronger as he continued. He died in Kevin Wallace's arms, asking Kevin to tell his mother he wasn't afraid. Kevin carried Rodriguez's body to safety, along with 8 other wounded men, making 7 trips across enemy fire because he refused to leave anyone behind. The crowd was completely silent as Walsh finished. "I attacked the man who saved Rodriguez's life while he was honoring Rodriguez's memory. I attacked a hero for being heroic. I attacked America for being American." Kevin nodded approvingly. "Now tell them what you learned." Walsh looked up at the crowd, his eyes red, but his voice steady. "I learned that the badge doesn't make you right. It makes you responsible. I learned that my job was to protect and serve Mr. Wallace, not to attack and humiliate him. I learned that every person I encounter as a police officer is someone's son or daughter, someone's hero, someone who deserves dignity and respect." He paused, gathering his courage for the most difficult part of his statement. "I learned that racism isn't just about burning crosses and using slurs. It's about assumptions, about seeing a black man and deciding he doesn't belong, about letting fear and bias guide my actions instead of training and humanity." The admission was powerful in its honesty and specificity. Walsh wasn't offering vague apologies or generic regrets. He was acknowledging the specific ways his racism had manifested and the specific harm it had caused. Kevin stepped forward and placed his hand on Walsh's shoulder. "Derek has spent the last 6 months learning what it means to serve others instead of controlling them. He's volunteered at 3 veteran organizations, participated in racial bias training, and written personally to every man whose life I saved at Firebase Charlie." The gesture of forgiveness was as powerful as any condemnation could have been. Here was a Medal of Honor recipient, a man who had every right to demand revenge, instead offering redemption to the officer who had wronged him. Chief Reynolds approached the microphone to announce the policy changes that had emerged from the incident. The Metropolitan Police Department has implemented the Kevin Wallace Protocol, mandatory training on veteran interaction, bias awareness, and de-escalation techniques. Every officer will visit this memorial as part of their training, and every officer will understand that protecting our veterans is protecting our values. The protocol was being adopted by police departments across the country, turning Kevin's painful experience into a catalyst for nationwide reform. But the most moving moment of the ceremony came when the Firebase Charlie survivors approached the wall together, each placing a small American flag beside the names of men who hadn't made it home. Doc Martinez spoke for all of them. "We came here today to honor our sergeant, but also to honor our brothers who didn't survive. Kevin Wallace saved our lives 50 years ago, and last month he saved our faith in America. Some of us are Republicans, some Democrats, some conservative, some liberal, but we're all Americans, and we all believe that service deserves respect, sacrifice deserves honor, and heroes deserve dignity." As the formal ceremony concluded, something unexpected happened. People began approaching the wall individually, touching names, leaving flowers, sharing stories with strangers about their own veterans, their own experiences with loss and service and sacrifice. The memorial became what it was always intended to be, not just a monument to the dead, but a living space for reflection, conversation, and connection. Kevin found himself surrounded by visitors who wanted to thank him, not just for his service, but for his response to injustice. A young black mother brought her son to meet him, explaining that she wanted her child to see what dignity looked like under pressure. A group of police officers from Chicago asked for his advice on improving community relations. A delegation of Vietnamese American veterans thanked him for showing that the war's legacy could be one of healing rather than division. But perhaps the most meaningful conversation was with a young veteran from Iraq who approached Kevin near the end of the day. "Mr. Wallace," the young man said, "I've been struggling with PTSD since I got back from deployment. Seeing what happened to you, how you responded with grace instead of anger, it's given me hope that I can handle my own battles." Kevin looked at the young veteran, seeing in his eyes the same weight that had burdened every generation of warriors. "Son, what's your name?" "Staff Sergeant Johnson, sir." "Marcus Johnson." "Marcus, the battles you're fighting now are just as important as the ones you fought overseas. Getting help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Taking care of yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. And healing isn't forgetting, it's learning to carry the weight without letting it crush you." The conversation continued for 20 minutes. Two generations of veterans sharing their experiences and supporting each other in the way the military family always had. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the memorial, Derek Walsh approached Kevin one final time. "Mr. Wallace, I know I can never undo what I did to you, but I want you to know that I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for it." Kevin studied Walsh's face, seeing genuine change in the young man's eyes. "Derek, you can't undo the past, but you can shape the future. Keep working with veteran organizations. Keep learning about the communities you'll serve. Keep remembering that every person you encounter is somebody's hero." "Yes, sir. And Mr. Wallace?" "Yes? Thank you for believing I could be better than my worst moment." Kevin shook Walsh's hand, the gesture witnessed by dozens of people who understood they were seeing something remarkable, not just forgiveness, but transformation. As the crowd began to disperse, Kevin remained at the wall with his Firebase Charlie brothers, sharing memories of Rodriguez and the other men whose names were carved in granite. They talked about the weight of survival, the responsibility of carrying their brothers' stories, and the satisfaction of seeing those stories honored rather than forgotten. "Sarge," Doc Martinez said as they prepared to leave, "you think any of this makes a difference? All the ceremonies and speeches and policy changes?" Kevin looked at the wall one more time, thinking about the 47 men he had saved and the millions of Americans who had learned about dignity under pressure over the past month. "Doc, I think about that day at Firebase Charlie sometimes, about why I kept going back into the fire. It wasn't because I thought I could save everybody. It was because I knew I could save somebody." He gestured toward the departing crowd, the police officers who had promised to do better, the young veterans who had found hope in his example, the former enemy who had become an ally in the fight for justice. Today isn't about saving everybody either. It's about saving somebody. And if we saved even one person from the kind of treatment I received, if we changed even one mind about what service means, if we gave even one person hope that America can be better than its worst moments, then this was all worth it. As Kevin Wallace walked away from the Vietnam Veterans Memorial for the second time in 3 weeks, he carried with him the same quiet satisfaction he had felt 52 years earlier when he carried his last wounded brother to safety. The mission was different, but the purpose was the same, leaving no one behind, protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, and believing that service to others was still the highest calling in American life. The memorial was quiet again, but it was no longer the same place where Derek Walsh had tasered an elderly veteran 3 weeks earlier. It had been transformed by truth, accountability, and the radical act of forgiveness into something stronger and more meaningful. A symbol not just of sacrifice, but of the possibility that America could still live up to its highest ideals. The healing had begun, and it was only the beginning. 2 years after Derek Walsh tasered Kevin Wallace at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the ripple effects of that 47-second encounter continued to reshape American law enforcement, veteran advocacy, and the national conversation about dignity, service, and redemption. On a crisp morning in November 2025, Kevin Wallace stood before 200 police recruits at the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center in Glencoe, Georgia. At 80 years old, He had become the most requested speaker at police academies across the country, not because he sought the spotlight, but because his story had become essential curriculum for anyone wearing a badge in America. "Raise your hand if you know why you're here," Kevin said to the assembled recruits, his voice still strong despite his age. Every hand went up. "Now keep your hand up if you're here to control people." Every hand went down. "Good. Because the moment you think your job is to control people instead of serve them, you become Derek Walsh on November 14th, and Derek Walsh lost his career, his reputation, and nearly his freedom because he forgot that the badge is about service, not power." The recruits listened with the kind of attention usually reserved for life or death training scenarios. Kevin's story had become legendary in law enforcement circles, not just as a cautionary tale about the consequences of racism and excessive force, but as a masterclass in dignity under pressure and the power of forgiveness. Standing at the back of the training room was Derek Walsh himself, now a civilian instructor who taught de-escalation techniques and bias awareness at police academies nationwide. The transformation from disgraced officer to respected educator had taken 2 years of hard work, therapy, and the kind of soul-searching that few people are willing to undertake. Walsh had become Kevin's unlikely partner in police reform, traveling to training sessions across the country to tell his side of the story, not to excuse his actions, but to help other officers understand how quickly good judgment could be corrupted by unchallenged assumptions and unchecked authority. "I want you to meet someone," Kevin told the recruits. "Derek Walsh was the officer who tasered me that morning. He's here today not to ask for sympathy or forgiveness. I already gave him that. But to help you understand how a decent person can make terrible choices when fear and bias override training and humanity." Walsh approached the podium with the careful humility of someone who understood that his credibility had been earned through accountability, not entitlement. He wore civilian clothes now, his police career permanently behind him, but his presence carried the weight of hard-won wisdom. "2 years ago, I was you," Walsh told the recruits. "Confident in my training, certain in my judgment, convinced that my badge made me right. Then I encountered an elderly black man at a memorial, and in the space of 2 minutes, I destroyed my career and attacked a national hero because I couldn't see past my own prejudices." The room was completely silent as Walsh recounted the events of that morning, sparing no detail of his aggressive approach, his escalating demands, his decision to use force against a peaceful elderly man. "I told myself I was following training, but I was following bias. I told myself I was ensuring safety, but I was ensuring humiliation. I told myself I was doing my job, but I was betraying everything the job is supposed to represent." A recruit raised her hand. "Sir, how do we avoid making the same mistake?" Walsh looked at Kevin, who nodded encouragingly. "You start by understanding that everyone you encounter is someone's father, mother, son, daughter, hero. You start by remembering that your job is to protect and serve all citizens, not just the ones who look like you or think like you. You also," Walsh continued, "surround yourself with people who will call you out when you're wrong." My partner that day said nothing. My supervisor said nothing. My department had created a culture where questioning another officer's actions was seen as betrayal. That culture nearly cost Mr. Wallace his life and did cost me my career. Kevin stepped back to the podium. "The question isn't whether you'll make mistakes. You will. The question is whether you'll learn from them, whether you'll accept accountability for them, and whether you'll use them to become better officers and better human beings." After the formal training session, Kevin and Derek met privately with the Academy's leadership to discuss the ongoing implementation of what had become known as the Wallace Protocols, comprehensive training standards for police-veteran interactions that had been adopted by over 300 departments nationwide. The protocols required officers to understand veteran culture, recognize signs of PTSD and service-related trauma, and approach veteran encounters with additional sensitivity and respect. More importantly, they established clear accountability measures for officers who failed to meet these standards. "The protocols are working," reported Chief Inspector Maria Santos, who had left the Metropolitan Police Department to become a federal police reform consultant. Complaints against officers in departments that have implemented the Wallace protocols are down 34% overall, and complaints involving veterans are down 67%. The statistics were encouraging, but Kevin was more interested in the stories behind the numbers. Officers who had diffused tense situations through patience and respect, departments that had built genuine partnerships with veteran communities, young recruits who understood that service was about humility, not authority. Later that afternoon, Kevin visited the Academy's Memorial Garden, where a new plaque had been installed honoring all veterans who had served as law enforcement officers. The dedication read, "In honor of those who served twice, first their country, then their communities, service before self, always." As Kevin read the inscription, he was joined by Colonel Sarah Martinez, Doc Martinez's daughter, who had followed her father into military service and was now a senior officer in the Army's Criminal Investigation Division. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "I wanted to thank you personally for what you've done for military-police relations. My father talks about you constantly, not just what you did for him in Vietnam, but what you've done for all veterans since that incident at the memorial." Kevin smiled, thinking about Doc Martinez, who had passed away peacefully 6 months earlier, surrounded by the men whose lives Kevin had saved at Firebase Charlie. "Your father was a good soldier and a better man. He taught me that healing others is just as important as protecting them. He also said you taught him that courage isn't just about facing enemy fire. It's about facing your own nation when it fails to live up to its ideals." The observation was quintessentially Doc Martinez, who had spent his final years advocating for veteran health care and civil rights. His funeral had been attended by over 1,000 people, including Kevin, Derek Walsh, and veterans from 5 different wars who had been inspired by the Firebase Charlie story. As evening approached, Kevin made his way to the Academy's main auditorium, where he was scheduled to deliver the keynote address to graduating recruits. The ceremony had become one of the most sought-after assignments for new officers, partly because of Kevin's presence, but mostly because of what the Academy now represented: a new model of law enforcement education that emphasized service, accountability, and human dignity. The auditorium was packed with family members, Academy staff, and law enforcement officials from across the country. In the front row sat a special group of guests, 12 Medal of Honor recipients who had come to support Kevin and to demonstrate the military community's ongoing commitment to police reform. "Ladies and gentlemen," the Academy director announced, "please welcome Medal of Honor recipient Kevin Wallace." The standing ovation lasted nearly 5 minutes, but Kevin's attention was focused on the 150 graduating recruits who would soon be patrolling American streets, interacting with American citizens, and making split-second decisions that could either build trust or destroy lives. "Recruits," Kevin began when the applause died down, "you are about to take an oath to protect and serve. Those aren't just words. They're a sacred promise to every citizen in every community you'll patrol." He looked directly at each section of graduates as he spoke. "You'll encounter people on the worst days of their lives, crime victims seeking justice, accident victims needing help, citizens in crisis requiring compassion. You'll also encounter people who challenge your authority, question your judgment, and test your patience." Kevin paused, thinking about his own encounter with Derek Walsh and the choice points that had defined both their responses to that crisis. In those moments, you'll have a choice. You can choose power over service, control over compassion, fear over courage, or you can choose to see every person you encounter as someone worthy of dignity and respect, regardless of their race, their age, their appearance, or their attitude. The recruits listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were hearing from someone who had faced the ultimate test of character and emerged with his dignity intact. 2 years ago, I was attacked by a police officer who made the wrong choice. He saw an elderly black man and decided I was suspicious. He saw someone kneeling at a war memorial and decided I was trespassing. He saw a citizen exercising his constitutional rights and decided I was a threat. Kevin's voice grew stronger as he reached the heart of his message. But here's what that officer didn't see. He didn't see a veteran honoring his fallen brothers. He didn't see a Medal of Honor recipient who had risked his life for strangers. He didn't see a citizen who believed in the America he had fought to defend. More importantly, Kevin continued, he didn't see a human being deserving of dignity and respect. And the moment you stop seeing the humanity in the people you serve, you stop being worthy of the badge you wear. The auditorium was completely silent as Kevin delivered his conclusion. You'll make mistakes. We all do. But when you make a mistake, you have another choice. You can cover it up, or you can own it. You can defend it, or you can learn from it. You can let it define you, or you can use it to become better. Derek Walsh, the officer who attacked me, made the right choice after making the wrong choice. He owned his mistake, learned from it, and dedicated his life to making sure other officers don't repeat it. That's why he's here today, not as a symbol of failure, but as a symbol of redemption. Kevin gestured toward Derek, who stood as the audience applauded, not for his past actions, but for his ongoing commitment to reform and education. I challenge each of you to be officers who never need redemption because you never abandon your humanity. Be officers who see service as privilege, not power. Be officers who understand that protecting and serving means protecting and serving everyone, especially those who can't protect themselves. As the ceremony concluded and the new officers took their oath, Kevin felt the same satisfaction he had experienced 54 years earlier when he carried his last wounded brother to safety at Firebase Charlie. The mission was different, but the purpose was the same: protecting those who needed protection, serving those who deserved service, and believing that individual actions could change the world. After the ceremony, Kevin was approached by Officer Rachel Chen, one of the graduating recruits, who had requested to speak with him personally. "Mr. Wallace," she said, "my grandfather was killed by police in San Francisco and he was an elderly Chinese immigrant who spoke limited English, and the officers who stopped him thought he was being non-compliant when he was just confused and scared." Kevin listened carefully, understanding that every family carried stories of encounters with law enforcement, some positive, many troubling. "I became a police officer to make sure what happened to my grandfather never happens to anyone else's grandfather. Your story gives me hope that we can actually change things, that we can be better." "Officer Chen," Kevin replied, "you already are better. The fact that you chose this profession to honor your grandfather's memory, that you see your badge as a tool for justice rather than power, that tells me the future of law enforcement is in good hands." As the evening wound down, Kevin found himself in a quiet conversation with Derek Walsh on the Academy's observation deck, looking out over the training grounds where the next generation of police officers was learning to serve rather than control. "Kevin," Derek said, using the familiar form of address that had developed during their 2 years of working together, "do you ever regret forgiving me? Do you ever think I didn't deserve a second chance?" Kevin considered the question, thinking about all the officers they had trained, all the departments they had reformed, all the incidents they had potentially prevented through their partnership. "Derek, forgiveness wasn't about what you deserved. It was about what America deserved. America deserved to see that accountability and redemption could coexist, that punishment and education could work together, that the worst moments don't have to define the final outcome. Besides," Kevin added with a slight smile, "I learned something in Vietnam that has served me well. The best way to defeat an enemy is to turn him into an ally. You're not my enemy anymore, Derek. You're my partner in the fight for justice." As they prepared to leave the academy, Kevin made one final stop at the Memorial Garden, where he placed a small American flag beside the plaque honoring veteran officers. It was the same ritual he had been performing at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial for 20 years, but now it carried additional meaning. Standing beside the memorial, Kevin thought about the journey that had brought him from Firebase Charlie to congressional hearings to police academies across America. Every step had been driven by the same principle: service to others, faith in American ideals, and the belief that individual courage could create collective change. His phone buzzed with a text message from his granddaughter, a West Point cadet who had chosen military service partly because of her grandfather's example. "Saw your speech online, Grandpa. Dad would be proud. We all are." Kevin smiled, thinking about his son Marcus, Killed in Afghanistan 15 years earlier while serving as an army medic, Marcus had followed his father's example of service, carrying on the family tradition of putting others before self. Now Marcus's daughter was preparing to do the same. As Kevin Wallace drove away from the Federal Law Enforcement Training Center, he reflected on the legacy that would outlive him. Hundreds of police officers trained in dignity and respect, thousands of veterans who knew their service mattered, millions of Americans who had witnessed the power of forgiveness and redemption. But perhaps the most important legacy was the simplest one, the idea that every person deserved to be treated with dignity, that every citizen had the right to expect justice, and that America could still be a place where service was honored and heroes were protected. The boy from Detroit, who had saved 47 lives under enemy fire, had spent his final years saving something even more precious, America's faith in its own ideals. And that salvation, like the men he had carried to safety in Vietnam, would endure long after the man who made it possible was gone. We know that every one of you who watched until the very end carries your own story of courage, injustice, or the choice between anger and grace. Kevin Wallace showed us that true strength isn't about fighting back. It's about lifting others up, even those who wrong us. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts. Have you ever been underestimated because of how you look? Have you witnessed someone being treated unfairly and wondered if you should intervene? Your voice matters, and your story could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today.